In a way, my father's life looks more like many women's lives, because he would do something for a while, and then something would happen and he'd move to something else. He did research in Bali, he worked on alcoholics, he studied schizophrenia, he got involved with ecology. But only because he did that, I think, was he able at a later stage in his life to recognize what were the threads that went through the whole sequence. And that was perhaps the most creative process of all.
So the composing a life's not just for women?
Absolutely not. But I think women know more about it.
They do, because we've lived it?
Well, you see, first of all, throughout history, there have been discontinuities in women's lives that there aren't in men's.
Like what?
Women's physical development has more obvious discontinuity in it. The difference, puberty, menopause, things like that. Not only that, pregnancy, lactation, weaning a child. There are these different tasks and stages in women's lives that demarcate rather clear time periods that women have learned how to bridge. One of the great ironies, you know, we think of so many of the problems of women with careers as new. But women have always had to deal with major shifts. I mean, nobody says, gee, I was doing pretty well as the mother of an infant, but I've been reassigned to being the mother of a toddler, and I'm having to learn it on the job. Okay, so to become the mother of a toddler, to become the mother of two instead of one, to become the mother of an adolescent, to become a mother-in-law. These are major job shifts that existed for women when their work was all organized around the home. They don't just happen today. So women, I think, throughout human history, have had to deal with discontinuities. And we have something to teach men that have to deal with more of them now than they used to.
But even though we've been dealing with discontinuities, we've had this perception that we expected to be in a continuous line of work or lifestyle. Is that what's happening? Is that we've always thought things were going to be the same?
Women have come into full participation in society against a background of myths and models that have been developed. First of all, they've been developed by men. And second of all, they've been developed in the past and not in the world we live in today. So that they don't fit men very well anymore either. But the models of a successful life that are held up to people tend to involve, you go to school, you get your training, and then you get on a nice rising curve and your income goes up. And you follow that until retirement. And then when your obituary appears, your career can be described in one word or two, and that's a successful life. But today, men and women have to shift gears at various stages in their lives. And the skill of shifting gears, let me tell you, I'm planning to have the New York Times publish a list when I die. Not a one-word obituary, that's right.
A list of all the different things you've done?
Right.
Okay. Well, the discontinuity can be personal and it can be professional. It is both those things.
This is true. But when, it's people expect one to be professionally monogamous.
So once you're a lawyer, you're always supposed to be a lawyer. Once you're a nurse, you're always a nurse.
That's right.
And that's not the way it's going to be.
Well, you see, even if you remain a nurse, you're going to have to learn new techniques constantly. And you're going to have to deal with changing understandings of the role of a nurse. In fact, you may have to struggle rather hard to change those understandings. I have a colleague at George Mason, and I was talking about the responsibility of a university to train people to be lifelong learners. And he said to me, if I'm in the hospital, I don't want the nurse that's looking after me to be a lifelong learner. I want her to know how to hitch up the IV. And I said, well, you just better make sure that the nurse hasn't been out of school for more than 2 or 3 years. Because if she has, she will have had to learn new techniques. And if she isn't a lifelong learner, she won't do a very good job. That's the situation we're in today. And a lot of people have, in fact, got the same title or the same name on their door, even while they're learning new techniques and adapting to a new business environment.
So even though they continue to hold the title, they're doing something totally different, or maybe different.
And they may do it better if they can tell themselves that they're doing something different. Instead of telling themselves, see, it's the same thing as women who say, oh, I've been doing the same thing for 20 years, I've just been a wife and mother. You know, that's a bit like the old line, I don't work, I'm just a housewife. I've been doing the same thing for 20 years. No woman who is a wife and mother, never mind her career, the workplace, those things, does the same thing for 20 years.
Because the situation changes, because the children grow up, because now they're dealing with teenagers or college students or dropouts or whatever they're dealing with.
Exactly.
I see. Well, what is the feedback you've gotten from your book? Are you reaching a chord of women, or I guess men, both, who have found that composing a life strikes a chord with them?
Yes, I get a lot of people who say, you're telling my story. Men and women. I think it's a harder book for men to think themselves into. I was being a little mischievous when I decided to write the book about women's lives, because I could easily have picked a group of, 3 men and 3 women, and made many of the same points. But we're so used to reading stuff that's supposed to be about human beings, except all the examples studied were male. So I thought I'd write a book about human beings in which my examples were female.
Well, one of the things that you talk about, you use the word composing, and I know you picked that on purpose, as opposed to what most of us feel like, which are major league jugglers that are worried about something crashing to the ground. Talk a little bit about this word composing.
Well, the word composing is supposed to have 2 meanings here. And they're both supposed to refer to the arts. First of all, there's composing music, where you vary something over time. And it has a pattern, but the texture changes. Then the other reference is to composing perhaps objects in a still life. Composing the forms and colors on a canvas, where one is putting together different elements in a way that balances in the present. Now, the notion composing a life as music refers to this issue of discontinuities. What does what you do in school, and what you do in your 20s, and what you do in your 30s, and what you do in your 50s, how are these things related? What are the transitions? What are the echoes? Fascinating thing about women's lives is the way they will pick something up out of 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and weave it back into the pattern the way a composer sometimes does with a theme. So that's one side of the book, is this thematic continuity across discontinuities. And then the other side of the book is, here we are with multiple demands in many cases. The women that I write about are all women for whom their work has been important, and they've had important relationships, and most of us have had children, and you're trying to balance these different things, which sometimes seem as if they just conflict. So the idea of composing, as in a painting, refers to combining multiple demands and priorities in the present.
Well, do the women that you wrote about, one of them was yourself, feel good about their composing? I mean, is that the difference, as you see yourself as a composer versus a juggler, and that makes the difference for how successful you feel about your life?
Well, one of the interesting things, I think, was that in the course of interviewing, as women got a chance to tell the story of their lives and I'm a very relaxed interviewer. I mean, mainly I just kept them talking. But I would ask about how this fit with that, and what skills they carried over from this to that, and so on and so forth. And I think they got more of the feeling themselves that there was a harmony in the way their lives fit together. One of the things that is being done in a lot of places is encouraging women to write autobiographies or journals as a way of regaining a sense that the patterns of their lives belong to them. It isn't so much of being in control. We're none of us in control, frankly. The world, we can't control the world around us. But you need it to belong to you. And you need to feel yourself making choices, not in total freedom, but finding opportunities, responding to things, setting a tone in terms of what's important to you.
So making choices is the way of feeling like you've got some control. You always have a choice. No?
You don't always have all the choices you'd like to have. No, I think often, we get a card is forced. When I finished my PhD, for which I wrote a dissertation on Arabic poetry and linguistics, my husband accepted a job in the Philippines. Now, that's a little bit like getting a degree in tropical medicine and suddenly being sent to Siberia. And I didn't at that time. I don't know if I'd go along with that today, but at that time, when we're talking the early 60s, at that time I didn't feel I had a choice about going. But the choice I had was figuring out what I would do in the Philippines and how I would use the skills I had at that point, because early Arabic poetry was not a hot skill in Manila.
Probably not.
And so the problem was, it was a problem of translation and a problem of learning new things. And actually my mother said something very interesting to me before we went off to the Philippines. She said, "You don't have a PhD in linguistics. PhDs aren't really in fields. A PhD says you have a capacity to do original research. So do it on something else." Which gave me the confidence to say, I spent all these years in school, I've got all these analytical skills and organizing skills and skills for something you might call original thinking. I'm going to take those skills and apply them in a totally new situation. And I think one can often do that, and yet the categories and the labels hold people back.
And we let them hold us back.
And we let them.
So your mother gave you permission to do something else, just like we should give each other permission.
That's right.
And that's probably what your book sort of does too, isn't it? It gives people permission to do that?
That's what I hope it does. It gives people permission, and also, and I one of the things I want to do is give permission to young people to explore and experiment. Not to feel that the first job they get out of college is going to determine the rest of their lives. So they need permission also. And they need permission to try to get into a risky line of work, or to try something they're not sure how good they'll be at it. And then possibly go back to school. And you have many women of this sort who go out and do something, and then they need another skill, and they come back and they go and do something else, maybe after 20 years. There isn't just one thing we need permission for. In other words, we need permission at every stage of the life cycle to live creatively, because there are no fixed models that will work for us. We're going to have to create our own.
When you talk about fixed models, you're talking about, I guess, role models in some ways, and life models. Did you have role models coming up?
I had lots of role models. The thing that's bad for people is having none, or I think only one. You see, people used to grow up in large extended families. Now, often there were very clear divisions that had to do with gender. But a boy growing up would have not just his father, he'd have his father, maybe his grandfather, 2 or 3 uncles as models that he could consider. A girl growing up would have a mother, some aunts, maybe a grandmother, and you would grow up with multiple models. And there would be Uncle George, who was a black sheep, so there would be some negative models of things that you were supposed to avoid being. And then we got into the problem of the nuclear family, of fewer available family members for growing up and understanding that to grow up and be a woman or to grow up and be a man is not a lockstep issue, but that even in a very traditional, stable society, you have a sense of variety. Now, as we move into the new situation with women participating in every aspect of the society and achieving, and hopefully this is going a little slower, but hopefully men participating in nurturance and caretaking and the tasks of the home, one of the things that's going to be happening is that both parents will be available as models to children of either sex. One of the people are always asking me, what's it like to grow up with a famous parent? And I always say to them, if you're going to grow up with a famous parent, there's only one solution: you better have 2. Because if you have one, then you're trapped in the example set by that one model. It doesn't encourage you to be yourself.
You're always trying to live up to that person.
Well, you're not just trying to live up to that person, you're trying to be like that person, which you probably can't be. Whereas if you have a number of models, then you're going to have to figure out your own way. Now, I grew up, it isn't just that I had 2 parents who were pretty impressive people, but the way my mother solved the child care problem was to have lots and lots and lots of friends who pinch hit in looking after me. And so there were all these people that I called Aunt so-and-so and Uncle so-and-so, who were very, very different people and who have been available to me all of my life as, alternate ways of thinking about the same problem. And I could see myself, as I go through different ages, drawing more, in this period, I'm drawing more on Aunt Mary, who looked after me a lot during the war. My mother was away during much of World War II. And now as I get older, I feel myself imitating Aunt Marie. These are not the same person. It's Mary and Marie. And I'm developing some of her traits. So I've got this whole cast of characters, including my mother, including my father, including a number of other male characters who are available, you see. And then when you do that, then you get back to the idea of composing. You're not just following a track, you're putting things together in your own way.
And that's okay. That's preferable to trying to live up to somebody else's expectations or the way the myths were, that you're supposed to stay on one track.
I think so.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting. I know Margaret Mead said something about having 3 husbands and that was a good thing to move on, and that's a continuity too, I think, is people, when their marriages dissolve, they feel like that's a major failure, and they're not able to overcome that. Is this the same sort of thing, is that you can pull those pieces back together?
One of the things that I think is happening in the United States today is that yes, there are a lot of divorces, and that's very upsetting, and a lot of disruption, and particularly in women's lives, poverty created by divorces, so that this is a major social problem. At the same time, marriage really wasn't designed, or it certainly wasn't developed, I'm not going to argue about design, but it wasn't developed to be a relationship that lasted for 60 years. 60 years, 70 years even, with the kind of lives that we live now. If you go into a colonial cemetery, you will find, Abigail, beloved wife of Jeremiah, died at such and such a time, and then you find Mehetabel, beloved wife of Jeremiah, and she died 15 years later, and then you find Elizabeth, relict of Jeremiah. He died. But they actually didn't as a pair. And if you look at the graves, not that many of them lived together as a pair for that many years. And so it's not surprising that given some freedom, given that marriage is no longer an inescapable box for people, we're going to get a good deal of turnover. And I think we're going to get people learning, we are getting, you can see it, ongoing friendships between ex-spouses.
You say,
if you don't expect the marriage to last forever, the sense of betrayal and failure is reduced.
so the expectations are different. You say trust God and keep the powder dry. Is this what advice you would give women who go into marriages these days?
Trust God and keep your powder dry. Yeah, I think it's not a bad piece of advice. That, I mean, I do believe that it is worth making a very real effort to keep a marriage going, and that this involves a good deal of change over time. I worry about young people who split up at the first sign of trouble, that they never experience the relationship that relationship would have become 5 years later, or 10 years later, or what have you. But at the same time, I would say to any young woman that she has to have the capacity to be self-supporting, that to go into, and that she ought to have her own credit rating, she ought to have some savings in her name, she should have the capacity to be self-supporting, and in that way she has the freedom to decide to remain in the relationship instead of being forced to.
Do you believe?
So that's part of keeping your powder dry.
Sure, that is part of it. I thought it was
And it isn't
good
face
advice.
powder either.
No. Do you think that women can have it all? Do you believe in the superwoman syndrome? Is composing a life having it all, or is it just choreographing it so that you can have as much as you can have?
I think women today often are working twice as hard as men. They're doing double shift work, or they're working half again as much as men. I don't think that's fair. I don't think superwomen exist. But what I do see women doing and learning to do is finding ways to fit things in, to combine them, so that you're not just adding this on top of this, on top of this, on top of this. You're learning to do things simultaneously. And so that you don't work quite twice as much as men. And with time, I think we'll share these things out better. But one of the great strengths I see that women have is, the trouble with men, one of the troubles, is they're encouraged to only think about one thing at a time. They're told they should concentrate. They forget what's going on at home when they get to the office. They're told to focus on goals. Sometimes I talk about women as peripheral visionaries because they keep an eye out of the corner of their eye, on a lot of different things. And this is something that we need very badly in the world today. Visionaries who have their eye on one thing in the future. You see, they're the ones that are wrecking the environment. People who have one index of success that they want to achieve, or one bit of political ideology. Then there are a lot of things that they can afford to simply ignore. In the book, I use two different phrases for talking about that go back to the stories of chivalry. On the one hand, there's the story of the knight on a quest. And the knight on a quest is seeking the Holy Grail, and his challenge is to ignore everything on the way. But the other is the questing knight, who rides forth and responds to needs that he encounters on the way. And I think many women are like that. They're peripheral visionaries. They're questing knights. They're responsive to what needs to be done.
And that's as good a model as the Holy Grail.
I think so.
Okay, I do too. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you all for watching. This has been Carol Miner with Florida Community College and Dr. Mary Catherine Bateson, and worth quoting. Thank you.